guys, I think we're going to get started this morning so that way we can give our speakers enough time today. So today is the second installment of the Circling Around series. So today we have two fabulous speakers, Samantha and Reza Haider, who are going to be presenting on fabulous topics. Samantha is going to go first. She's one of our stars listeners. She is a regular tracking board, went to Harvard Medical School and Harvard Business School. Before she came here for internal medicine residency, she used to be working as a hospital secretary in innovation before she applies to cardiology fellowship. So let's focus.
So thank you so much for that warm introduction, Millie, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to talk about innovation in healthcare because I truly believe that we've all already seen really large changes to the way healthcare is practiced, and we'll continue to see changes throughout our careers. And I think the perfect people to lead those changes are sitting right here in this room. So what I hope you leave here with today is a broad overview of what innovation in healthcare is, what are some of the key pieces and resources to think about when going down this path, and perhaps most importantly, why doctors are so critical to it. So why do we care about this topic? As I mentioned, the healthcare landscape is constantly changing, and it's going to continue to dramatically shift throughout our careers. I've included here a snapshot of one such technology that's gained traction lately, which is global remote patient monitoring, which is currently over a $4 billion market. And additionally, I have these graphs on the right, which show some of the expected rapid rise for other technologies, such as artificial intelligence or blockchain in healthcare. And we can begin to think about how this is going to change the way that we're practicing. And it's likely that some of the biggest innovations that are going to impact us haven't even been thought of yet. So innovation is a bit of a buzzword, so I'd like to offer one definition that I think nicely summarizes the general intent. And this is from the WHO, and they offer it's a new or improved solution with the transformative ability to accelerate positive health impact. And many other definitions include something along this second part, so I want to include that as well, which is the successful implementation of this solution. So essentially, it's not just enough to have an idea or to create something, but you have to actually make sure that it's adopted. Innovation can go across a wide spectrum of different topics. So things like technology, whether it's medical devices or information technology, such as our electronic health records, treatments, whether it's a new surgical technique or a new procedural technique, or drugs. And then there's a lot of innovations around how healthcare is delivered as well, whether that's in the clinical setting or thinking about insurance reform. I'd be remiss to speak on this topic without highlighting some of the great things that WashU has done previously, such as the PET scan, their integral work on the Human Genome Project, and developing the first commercially available troponin I test. And when I looked, there's actually over 60 startups that are currently listed on the WashU Innovation Center website. So a lot that's going on today. So I'd like to think a little bit about what you need to consider when you're feeling like this might be an area that you want to go into. And there's two frameworks that I've laid out here. The first is about product creation, where you go through this process of identification and then invention and then implementation. And then simultaneously, you want to think about actually building a business along with this. So building that business model, thinking about your sources of funding, which I'll talk about just a little bit, and then also building that user base. So the first step in this process is needs identification. And I think this is really important for doctors to be involved with because they can bring their expertise in to best identify some of the unmet needs. And what are those current treatment options and where are those current treatment options maybe leading to suboptimal outcomes and might be a nice space to offer something new. Once you've started to think about what that unmet need or that general focus that you want to focus on is, then you have to really think about how big is the problem. And there's this concept called TAM, SAM, SOM, which is essentially what is the total addressable market I might be reaching into. And that might be all patients with a certain disease. The SAM, or the serviceable available market, is what portion of that do you think you could maybe actually target? So maybe it's all patients with a disease who would actually qualify for an intervention. And then the serviceable obtainable market is, of those people who qualify, what portion of them do you think you could realistically capture? And that's often, comparing whatever you're going to offer versus the current treatment paradigm. So this is just to make sure that what you're tackling is big enough to merit the investment of time. The next step is really fun. It's this concept generation step. And this is where you just want to build up as many ideas as possible. And this can be either a solo activity or a team activity. And the purpose here is to really be broad, non-judgmental, and encourage wild ideas. So sometimes you can't even judge what a good idea is until you're comparing it to bad ideas. But you do that at the end. So at this point, you're just putting rapid fire down as many things as possible, seeing one small idea and letting it spark something else. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. I've included one approach here where you're really just putting Post-its down about a general concept. But other times people recommend, having something like Play-Doh, just so you can kind of build something with your hands and visually have your creativity stimulated that way. You can also go out to customers at this stage and get a sense of what they would want. But it's important to keep in mind that old adage from Henry Ford that if he had asked customers what they would have wanted, they would have said faster horses. So once you've collected all of your ideas and started to select which ones you might want to go forward with, the next step is to build in this minimal viable product, or MVP. So this is really the barest thing that you need in order to start testing your idea. So if your initial or eventual thing is maybe a product, you might just be using duct tape or plastic just so that people can visually see what you're talking about. Or if you're building an app, for example, maybe you're just using screenshots or a really buggy version of what you might finally release. And there's this concept of failing fast, which I realize sounds kind of scary, but you essentially want to get into this repetitive cycle of building something, asking for feedback, and then revising it. And you want to avoid just essentially like sitting in a room, spending a ton of time and energy, trying to create something that seems perfect, going out and then finding at that stage that it's not really the right thing. And so doing this quick repetitive cycle allows you to hone in much more rapidly on that final solution. And often the best way to know if this is something that might be a viable solution or not is to go and talk to the toughest critics and ask them for their feedback. So as you're going through this identification step and this inventing step, and starting to think about actually getting this out there, it's also important to think about building the business. And you want to start to think about how you're going to extract value for what you've done. It's really important to think about who this is going to impact and if they're going to want this solution kind of changing their current workflow. And for example, if you release something that might make a medical alternative to a current surgical solution, there might be, some pushback from surgeons. So there's a lot of key players that it's important to consider when you're doing this. Another thing to be mindful of is the regulatory clearance that you might need to go through. And then as you're going from that selected minimal viable product to the final product, you have to think about the scale involved. So if this is indeed a tangible product, you have to think about the manufacturing capacity and if there's quality at that full scale manufacturing. If it's an app, do you have the server support and the tech support to help triage any kind of bugs that come up? And then you have to think about the sales strategy as well. So for all of these factors and many more, sales are really tricky in the healthcare market. And so you can either build that capability of selling yourself, or you can do something like licensing with another firm that might already have that expertise. So healthcare market, as I think you all know, is very different from pretty much all other markets. And there's a lot of reasons why, many of which are probably familiar to you. So I just want to highlight a few. The customer here, or really the person that we're trying to improve the outcome for, is often a patient who isn't paying for things themselves. Additionally, they're not always choosing the treatment. Often this is at least mediated or guided by the people in this room, as well as sometimes insurance companies. And then, this isn't necessarily the concept of a free market that we see elsewhere, because of things like not really having price transparency. And then there's a lot of misaligned incentives. So for example, if a patient is frequently changing insurance companies year to year, they're not really as incentivized to approve something where the outcomes aren't going to be realized until many years down the line. Although I think we should assume best intent on everyone involved, but it does create this misalignment of incentives. If it's a new procedure, you might be thinking, okay, I can get maybe a new CPT code approved for this, but that's a really time-intensive process and certainly not guaranteed. And then if it's something that's going to be deployed in a hospital and they can't get reimbursed for it, that's an additional cost for that hospital. So you have to think that, are they going to be willing to bear that additional cost? And they're going to have to really view that this innovation is truly advancing the standard of care. And then briefly on the regulation side, so on the medications, I think probably most people are familiar with the FDA process for clinical trials. I did want to highlight the Orphan Drug Act and the Breakthrough Drug Designation, which the FDA has to essentially incentivize development in underserved or niche areas. But you might be less familiar with the regulations around devices. So I did want to mention that here, where there's these 3 classes from class 1 through class 3. Class 1 might be something like a Band-Aid, where you don't need as much safety data around it. But class 3 might be something such as a heart valve, where you're going to want a lot more safety. But it's a very different process than some of the clinical trial process that we're more familiar with. And so I also wanted to make an argument at this time that innovation should really be providing value. And Michael Porter had defined this as patient health outcomes divided by the cost of care. And a more expanded version of this might include things like quality, safety, and the patient experience in the numerator. But the essential thing is to realize that, if you increase outcomes, value goes up. If you decrease care, value goes down. Simple, everyone can just kind of move on, right? Well, in practice, thinking about what that ideal outcome to measure is really challenging. And even if you came up with that perfect ideal outcome, actually measuring it is also challenging. And costs are relatively easier to measure, but it's not always super straightforward either. So one controversial innovation that's come out is robotic surgery. And this is something that our patients are also starting to wonder is this really providing value to us? And so the New York Times had written up this article, and it was based on a review article of 50 randomized controlled trials, questioning if robotic surgeries are really better. And what they said was that of these 50 randomized controlled trials, that of the ones reporting long-term outcomes, there was no difference of mortality in between robotic surgery, laparoscopic, and open. They did note that robotic surgeries often took longer. And then there was this quote from a surgical resident who essentially said, just because it's new and fancy doesn't mean it's better. And I think that's important for us all to keep in mind. At the same time, not included on this slide was another quote from a surgeon who said, There's some ergonomic benefits to this, and we think some of our attendings might be able to practice longer. They're seeing their careers expand by maybe up to a decade. And so then you start thinking about the patient access that might be improved by having longer surgical time careers, and how does that impact the value equation? So it's certainly not clear cut, but I think something important to keep in mind. So returning to our framework, and we'll make the assumption that we've evaluated our innovation and feel that we are definitely adding value. I wanted to pivot to this final point on adoption. So there are these key people who can really help get your innovation from where it is out there into the more adopted clinical practice. And we label these people as promoters. And so this is often the clinicians or the surgeons who would be using this. Sometimes it's a key decision maker, whether it's someone in hospital administration or insurance, but they're really those people who are going to promote this innovation. It's a really complicated decision-making process. A promoter has to be willing to innovate. They have to be willing to take that risk on. And they have to think about that cost of actually having that innovation. So one example is even when electronic health records first started gaining traction, there was the cost of the actual electronic health record, but then there were all these unrealized costs of loss of clinical throughput during the time of adoption and things like that. So there are also all these unrealized costs that we don't often speak about. And sometimes people in these key decision-making process, they have their own personal stake in another alternative. So you also have to factor that in. So in order to take on all of these risks, they have to see that there's some sort of deficiency in the system in front of them and use that to justify the risk of taking on an innovation. And then I wanted to really briefly point out this graph where you see that you get these early adopters who might take on an innovation, and then the system kind of stabilizes. And it takes time for momentum to really build up until you reach this inflection point where the innovation becomes the standard of care, and the standard of care becomes, or the prior standard of care becomes more obsolete. So it's really important along all of this to think about how you're going to fund your work. So as you're building your team, your minimal viable product, getting it into that product development stage and starting to build and scale your business, that takes a lot of money. You have to pay salaries and sometimes your vendors and things like that. And so what I've shown here is what we call a cumulative cash flow curve, where essentially you can almost think about it as debt. As your bills are racking up, you're paying out. And then at this point here, you maybe actually release your product, you start to make a little money back, and you're chipping away at this debt essentially until you reach a positive. So to fund all of that time, you need some source of funding. The earliest funding sources are typically things like family and friend rounds or angel investors. And these are usually smaller checks. They're usually a little bit of a higher risk because a lot of these smaller companies don't end up actually becoming a full mature company. So these people might not get their money back at any point. As you become a little bit more stable, you can access these other funding sources such as venture capital and then later down the line, private equity. So hopefully you're all feeling very inspired. So I wanted to make some arguments about why we all should be leading innovation. So first off, as clinicians, doctors are intimately familiar with the patient needs, their pain points, and what the unmet medical requirements are. And they can ensure that innovations are tailored to address real-world healthcare challenges. They can also critically evaluate the clinical validity and practicality of solutions. And they can act as these intermediaries between technical experts, industry partners, and patients, really bridging this gap and bringing together effective collaboration. And then last, it's a really compelling story to have a physician founder, as firms founded by user innovators are more likely to receive venture funding and generate higher revenues. And I'm gonna skip forward a little bit because I realize I'm going short on time. So I wanted to do a brief overview of who are the entrepreneurs that we're seeing today. So this was from a study out in Massachusetts where they looked at everyone with a medical license there. And the one thing I wanted to highlight particularly is that women had a lower odds of entrepreneurship. And this is really important because we actually see across all industries that female founders are much less frequent. And while this study didn't look at other potential demographics, we do know that minority founders are often less frequent. So I think by focusing on this, on these disparities, we can make sure we're giving support to a diversity of founders. Okay, so how to get involved. So one of the first things you can do is be available to some of your colleagues. So you don't know who next to you is actually already starting to think about something and might ask you to donate some time. And that might be a really informal thing at first, but maybe it turns into something exciting down the line. A slightly more formalized version of that is hackathons. So this is really where you're bringing in people from multiple different specialties. So physicians, maybe a computer scientist, an engineer, and the goal is to bring them all to the table and let them find out what sort of unmet needs they might want to focus on, and make sure that all of these different expertise and skill sets are contributing. And then there's these other programs like incubators and accelerators where the general idea is to bring these early products up into a more developed product, help you generate your business plan, and provide support to mentorship and access to investors. So with that, I'll just show my resources very quickly. And then extend a big thank you to Dr. Husani, Dr. Maddox for all of their helpful feedback on my presentation, to the chief residents and Dr. Chang for inviting me to talk today, and especially to the Department of Medicine and Dr. Fraser for their support in senior grand rounds, and my partner Will for all of his support as well, and our dog.
Thank you, Dr. Harris, for that phenomenal presentation. Next, we have Dr. Reza Haider, who's coming to us originally from Elizabethtown, Kentucky. I may be biased, but I think Kentucky is the best state. Yes, thank you. He came to us from the University of Kentucky College of Medicine, my classmate there, really proud of Reza, where he got his MD and then also got his MBA there. It seems to be a theme today. Before he came to us for internal medicine residency, he is applying to GI fellowship right now, where he will be phenomenal, I'm sure, go to a great program. And so he's going to give us a great talk today. So let's welcome Dr. Reza Haider.
Good morning, everybody. So I will be talking about designing the digital colonoscopy patient navigator. So we'll begin by delving into the significant implications of the morbidity of colorectal cancer and how the affected demographic has shifted over the last several decades. We'll touch on current challenges in colorectal cancer screening adherence, particularly as they pertain to colonoscopy utilization data here at our own institution. We'll evaluate existing ongoing intervention strategies at our own institution and those tested elsewhere to reduce unplanned cancellations. We'll then introduce the Digital Colonoscopy Patient Navigator, or DCPN for short, introduce some of its functions and its advantages and how we plan to test for its efficacy. And lastly, we'll touch on some possible future functions of the application. Colorectal cancer ranks as the third leading cause of cancer-related death in the United States. This stark reality highlights its substantial toll on our patients' well-being. There has been a surge in colorectal cancer diagnoses among a younger population. Lifestyle factors are thought to play a pivotal role in driving this trend. The rise of colorectal cancer cases among the younger demographic mandates strategic solutions. Addressing the unique challenges they face in accessing and benefiting from colorectal cancer screening is of paramount importance. Screening colonoscopy remains a robust strategy to mitigate colorectal cancer risk. Recent divergence in national organization guidelines underscores the nuanced discussions surrounding colorectal cancer prevention but highlights a shift towards a younger screening age. Notably, colonoscopy remains the gold standard to detect and remove precancerous tissue. It's definitive for early colorectal cancer detection, where a prompt response yields a commendable 90% 5-year survival rate. After patients choose to undergo a colonoscopy, things can get complicated. 15 to 40% of eligible patients for screening programs don't engage or successfully complete testing. In 2022, at BJC endoscopy, there was a 16% cancellation rate, with 74% of those cancellations happening 48 hours before the procedure. Patient satisfaction also suffers. Among those treated at BJC endoscopy in 2023, 63% would recommend their experience to others. Colonoscopy, often a healthcare system entry point for otherwise healthy individuals, holds significance beyond its procedural nature. A subpar bowel prep resulting in unsuccessful procedure can cultivate distrust towards healthcare and may lead to decreased healthcare utilization and participation in screening programs. So why do patients have reservations to engage in screening? This table, published in the American Society of Clinical Oncology, highlights patient, provider, system, and policy factors that serve as barriers to patients getting necessary screening. As you can see, common themes emerge among patient factors, including knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions related to screening. Cultural barriers also exist. And as you can imagine, and many of you have probably experienced, these conversations can be difficult for patients to engage in. With all the misinformation, fear, and anxiety that exist regarding this procedure, we need the process of getting a colonoscopy to be as streamlined as possible. So once someone agrees to get a colonoscopy, what leads to unplanned cancellations? That's also complicated. Numerous studies have delved into the factors that contribute to unplanned cancellations of colonoscopy and have found that medical comorbidities that complicate bowel prep, such as gastroparesis, previous cancellations, poor health literacy, language barriers, have all been associated risk factors with unplanned cancellations. Additionally, there are nuanced patient instructions on the patient side and operational logistics from the institution side that serve as pain points in the pre-procedural phase and opportunities for failure. After analysis of utilization data collected here at BJC endoscopy from 2022 to 2023, we found the most frequent causes of unplanned cancellations to be scheduling miscommunications, lack of education regarding dietary and med instructions, transportation failures, bowel prep failures, and patients having understandable fear and anxieties regarding the procedure itself. As you can see, many of the cited factors for unplanned cancellations are addressable in the pre-procedural phase. So what interventions are being tested or are being currently implemented to reduce unplanned cancellations? Many have been emerged nationwide and are currently being tested here at BJC, while others have been tested across the country. These solutions include nurse navigators, SMS-based task instructions for streamlined communication, and smartphone applications with purely educational content. At present, BJC employs nurse navigators who play a pivotal role in guiding patients through the colonoscopy process. These navigators offer a comprehensive range of services, including reinforcing information about the procedure, its benefits, its associated risks via scheduled phone calls. They also provide support in bowel preparation and coordinating travel logistics. Lastly, they provide troubleshooting with on-call access. The implementation of nurse navigators has demonstrated significant results. Over the past several months, it has contributed to a remarkable reduction in unplanned cancellations from around 20% monthly to 8%. However, challenges persist, including dependency on human inputs, managing a very high call volume, which can reach up to 100 to 120 calls a day. This puts significant strain on nursing bandwidth and introduces variable touches when patient calls can come unpredictably at times. Additionally, as you can see, nurse navigators must manually input process metrics, such as documenting their call encounters, noting if a patient answered the phone or not, which makes process improvement difficult to track and improve upon. Most strikingly, the rate of phone call responses remains low, with 20 to 60% of patients answering calls on any given day. Several different studies have assessed the impact of SMS-based text reminders. A randomized controlled trials conducted at an urban academic medical center compared 9 text messages to standard of care phone calls and found no difference in the completion of procedures with adequate bowel prep, interestingly. A second study with 1,600 patients and a more rigorous 16-step text platform with links to educational resources, directions, cancellation policies actually found a positive effect. The institution partnered with Medumo, a Boston-based startup acquired by Philips, focused on digital healthcare innovation, and compared their text stream to standard of care and found improvements in ADR, decreased no-shows, and improved satisfaction. And lastly, a study conducted at a place you may find familiar with names that you may also have seen before, assessed an SMS-based intervention, an interactive text messaging system, and found that it improved colonoscopy rates, adherence rates in a VA population setting. Interestingly, they found an even greater magnitude of effect in older patients. I would say the takeaways are that there is merit in text-based communication with room for improvement in the bidirectionality function, compliance, and user interface. We can do better. In the post-COVID telehealth era, the modern-day patient is well adapted to the digital healthcare interface and desires convenience at their fingertips. Our solution is simple: to provide a web-based app to help guide patients at our institution to augment the process of getting a colonoscopy. Our app will employ novel functions to reduce the rate of unplanned cancellations, including having appointment reminders, real-time bowel prep troubleshooting, capitalizing on the bidirectional input with radial buttons. Our app will have customized decision flow algorithms that are tailored to each patient and their specific need. The user interface will also allow us to collect data in real time to mitigate unplanned cancellations and identify patients at high risk for failure, to triage Nurse Navigator resources, and hopefully train models to automate the procedural phase. So this schematic, I hope, kind of helps understand exactly what we'll be doing. So currently, patients interact with Nurse Navigators. With the DCPN, patients will then be able to input data regarding their colonoscopy process when they receive timed reminders. Back-end risk stratification and analytics of high-risk patients for failure will then alert Nurse Navigators to target patients for more tailored interventions and troubleshooting, and even rescheduling the appointment to avoid an unplanned cancellation. So how does the DCPN compare to existing innovations? Well, I'm sorry, let me back up. So this is a sample flow decision algorithm that was based on the risk factors most predictive of bowel prep failure when we performed a multiple logistic regression of all of the steps of the pre-procedural phase. It also incorporates risk factors for bowel prep failure that exist based off the literature. So this is just an idea to kind of give you the schematic of how the app will be thinking. So how is this product innovative? So, and how does it compare to what already exists? So currently, BJC nursing leadership is implementing Nurse Navigators who are assigned to certain patients. We've kind of talked about this earlier in the talk, and as you can see, the Nurse Navigators have certain advantages, such as bidirectional communication, real-time troubleshooting, and they also have key stakeholder buy-in by being the existing process here at BJC. Our app will have all of those functions. Additionally, some of the other text-based platforms that we alluded to with the previous trials, our app will build on those functions, but most importantly, this will be the first that has bidirectional functionality, which will actually take patients' input data from them being able to answer the prompts. Additionally, we will incorporate analytics to identify patients high risk for bowel prep failure so that our Nurse Navigators can target their interventions towards them. We have a multidisciplinary team with well-rounded expertise, highlighting a background in advanced endoscopic procedures, quality improvement as it pertains to colorectal cancer screening, gastroenterology educational content creation, and nurse navigator leadership. We have partnered with a local digital healthcare innovation software company called Platform STL to develop our application software, whom have experience partnering with WashU School of Medicine to build innovative tools to improve clinical care in pathology, PM&R, and palliative care. So our project aims include identifying risk factors for unplanned cancellations, which we've already completed via multiple regression analysis of the pre-procedural variables and that are specific to BJC workflows. And our work will be presented at the American College of Gastroenterology conference here in October. We're currently in phase 2 and are working with Platform STL to develop our minimal viable product for pilot testing and reiterative testing to design the optimal version with an attractive user interface. And lastly, phase 3 will be measuring the app's effectiveness in clinical trial. We will be conducting a single institution randomized clinical trial to assess efficacy for the application over a 6-month period, comparing the DCPN in conjunction with the nurse navigator to standard of care with the nurse navigation alone. Patients will be randomized into a 1-to-1 ratio. We estimate to have a sample size of roughly 6,000 patients in that time frame to either group at the time of intervention, at the time of scheduling. In addition to measuring unplanned cancellations, we'll be measuring a few secondary outcomes, including assessing improvement in patient and nurse navigation experience, additional process metrics, including number of additional touches, and clinical metrics, such as the patient's bowel prep score and adenoma detection rate. So our upcoming timeline includes application development into Q4 2023 with reiterative improvement of the application, interface, algorithms, in UI in Q1 2024, and we aim to conduct our efficacy trial in Q2 2024. So there are several possible future directions and functions of the app, including software capabilities currently being tested by a group in China, leveraging artificial technology to analyze patient-submitted images of stool to predict bowel prep score preemptively. So we hope that if this technology continues to prove its efficacy and our application also is viable, that perhaps there could be some combination thereof in the future. Additionally, with the development and improvement of OpenAI technology, we hope future app iterations will integrate chatbot technology to allow for more personalized troubleshooting and automate the pre-procedural phase of colonoscopy even further. With the DCPN, we hope to pave a new path to reducing colorectal cancer deaths and improving the colonoscopy experience, one that meets the modern needs of the modern day patient. Thank you.
Both those were terrific talks. Thanks so much. I think we have time for a few questions. Up in the back.
Basically, there's an app for everything, and I know from personal experience, I received a stud finder, and I opened stud finder. There was an app to use the stud finder. That was just ridiculous. I personally don't like buying a tons of apps. What are your thoughts on patients being willing to download the app to even start the process with DCPN?
That's a really good point, and something that we considered as well. As if you're like me, the memory load on your phone is maxed out pretty much all the time. So wanting to download something else doesn't seem ideal. So to circumvent that, what we have done is instead of designing an application that is downloaded at the time of scheduling, the web-based forms will actually be linked to SMS-based text. So when, as an example, if a patient at the time, 7 days before the procedure, we need to know if the patient has received their bowel prep or is on a blood thinner. that will be linked to a text and a web-based form. And so there's no load on your smartphone. It will just be a text.
So I have a question. You noted the disparity for entrepreneurship and successful IP for women, and then also some other predictors of success. So do you have ideas about what we could do to sort of equalize and opportunities for all genders?
Yeah, so I think there's a opportunity to both just early on, I think we have to be very supportive of people who are starting to say like this might be a path, and make sure that they have good mentors that are helping them along. So I think that's kind of one approach of making sure people are entering the funnel, but I think the other approach is making sure that people who are in that funnel are actually getting support and funding and things like that. So one solution that I've seen a little bit is funds that are specifically designed for minority or woman founders, where their goal is to really have, if not their entire, to break that down a little bit. So a venture capital might raise a fund, a large amount of money that they're going to invest over many companies over the lifespan of the fund. And so they might start to build in some requirements of a certain proportion of this has to go to a women founder team, or a certain proportion of this has to go to a minority founder. And so I think it's an idea that's gaining traction, or some funds are just focused in that area. But it's hard to really otherwise kind of, this is people's own money and their own risk profile. So it's hard to really do anything except shed attention on the light. And we also know that diversity of thought is going to result in much better ideas. So when everyone around the table looks the exact same, that's going to not be as creative or as good of a solution. So I think as people recognize that, it really makes them feel, oh, this isn't just a checkbox that I'm trying to do, but I truly believe that our fund will perform better as we have these different representations.
As businesses continue to innovate, they potentially may develop financial conflicts of interest in their companies themselves. What regulations are there for the patients and consumers to be protected from that?
So yeah, that's a good question. I should be a little better versed than I am with some of the exact names. So I'll be a little vague and say that there are regulations and there are certain policies about kickbacks. So essentially, for example, if you are the inventor of something and you're selling to a hospital, and you might make money off of that, that's something that has a lot of scrutiny. And you have to sell pretty much at market value. So there's a lot less sometimes negotiation that can come into play, where you can't just try to get the highest price, but you have to actually give a fair price because of that concern of kickbacks. But I should be a little bit better versed by that. But I will say that that is something that's definitely focused on. And interestingly, when I was preparing this talk and trying to get some of this data about doctors as entrepreneurs, some of the earliest studies I saw were from the time of the 70s and 80s, and it was really a big ethical question at that time whether doctors could really create something that would cost money, and whether that would lead to kind of a murky ethical dilemma in terms of the care that they're also providing. And so that's actually where a lot of the attention was back in those early papers, which I think now people feel more comfortable saying that we can both be ethical and also create something and want to be compensated for what we're creating.
So just to add to that, in academic medical centers, and clearly here at Washington University, we have very rigorous policies and procedures for disclosures of conflicts of interest. So, and there are rules and regulations and a system of committees that oversee those interactions to create firewalls to protect the patients, but also to create categories in which patients have to be notified of those potential financial conflicts of interest as well. So this is a pretty regulated area, particularly in academic medical centers, and for things where there are companies also that have to disclose payments to physicians that are publicly reported. So in terms of the colonoscopy navigator, you know, if you look at the no-show rates at Barnes West County GI, for instance, for screening endoscopy versus down here, the rates of no-show is much higher down here, which is obviously a reflection of the severity of the patient population as well as social determinants of health. So what do you think are going to be some of the key drivers to address those social determinants of health factors that relate to noncompliance, specifically with your innovation?
Yeah, that's a great point, Dr. Fraser. So when we were designing the app, we considered how socioeconomic factors would play a role in compliance and utilizing the app. Some preliminary research we found that was done in a journal of sociology. I don't have the name of the paper right now. Interestingly found that in Missouri, 40 to 50% of individuals that identify as homeless own a smartphone. And I think that was shocking to me to find, in that I think that nowadays, many patients with certain social determinants of health that poses barriers to them getting access to care are amendable to utilizing digital healthcare solutions. I think that personally in the resident care clinic, I have found that it has been difficult to utilize phone calls to reach patients, to convey instructions, to discuss results, et cetera. And with the advent of MyChart as an example, I think the ability, at least for myself, to communicate with patients has been improved. So I think, to answer your question, I think the application format, the text message format, and having a web-based platform in of itself will help address the socio-determinants of health that are preventing our patient population to getting access to colonoscopy. But number two, a function of the app, which we are hoping to develop, is the specificity and personalized nature of the interface that patients experience. One thought that we had is that patients with vision impairment could have larger radial buttons when they open their app interface. And I think that developing cultural competent content and how we word what patients see in the user interface will be another way to address that concern. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. I think, you know, what many of us often forget to do is to actually engage patients in what their needs really are. So, you know, I think your app sounds like it has tremendous potential, but we also have to think about how, if they don't have transportation,